think that storytelling stuff has a place. But for the most part, we want to be able to say, here's my point of view on this that I've really thought about. And here's what needs to come behind that.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Book Leads Impactful Books for Life and Leadership. I'm your series host and leadership performance coach, John Jaramillo. This podcast series is about getting to the books that have impacted the lives of the people in my network. So these are great leads that I'll be having these conversations with to get to those books that have contributed the most to their life, their work, their leadership, their business. All those worlds intersect. And my guest today is Davina Stanley. And Davina is the founder of Clarity First, which helps executives get to the point when engaging senior leaders and boards. She offers a mix of private and public programs, self-paced learning, articles, podcasts, and other resources to help executives communicate better. With over 20 plus years of experience, she began her communication coaching career at McKinsey Company in Hong Kong, helping consultants improve their communication, and is one of the few people globally accredited by Barbara Minto to teach the pyramid principle. Since then, she has built an international client base spanning predominantly tech, retail, and finance sectors, and authored 3 books on business communication. She works with leaders to set up their teams to prepare papers and presentations that those same leaders no longer need to rewrite. Davina lives in Seattle, Washington with her husband and loves spending time with her 2 adult sons and broader family in Australia and the UK. Davina, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, John. I'm looking forward to it.
So who are you today, Davina? I mean, obviously there's a history to your work. I love this focus you have, this concentration you have on communication. I love that you have this connection between not just somebody in the workplace or somebody in business and communication, but also the strength of communication behind leadership. Because as a leadership coach, I've seen so often that it's not so much the work that's being done or not done or whatever the procedures or processes or anything that is taking place in the company that is the issue. It's lack of communication, whether you're getting it and it's poor or there's no communication at all. That's what I've seen in so many people that I've worked with, so many environments that I've worked in myself, so many clients that I've coached. So I'm grateful to have you here. I think nowadays it seems like communication is an evolving discipline, I would say. Not that we ever think we get it right, but we see so many things in society and culture, in politics, in government, all across the board where we can continue improving. So I'm excited to learn from you, your past, your story, and your book.
I'm excited to talk with you as well. So I agree with you. Communication's evolving and so quickly, particularly at the moment with AI. You know, people are relying on it for all sorts of things, advice for what to say to whom and how to say whatever it is that they need to say. It's a fabulous tool. I think, you know, the human element of communication is just so important. And in the world that I work in, which is the more formal communication, where people are putting forward an idea in a meeting that they've had to think about, or they're putting together a PowerPoint presentation or a report of some sort, you know, knowing what to say that resonates with humans is, you know, sometimes very challenging.
Yeah.
How much do you say? How often? About what? In what way? All of that. And who is the right person to say it to as well is also sometimes quite challenging. So it's never boring. I thought
No, not at all. Not at all.
I never thought I'd end up teaching and coaching people this long in communication.
Oh, we'll get to your why you're on that path. It's funny you mentioned the selection of words. While I was working out this morning, I go through YouTube and just kind of see what's out there, hopefully learning something while I'm working out. And I came across an interview with Tony Robbins, and he was talking to his interviewer. And he said something to the interviewer about, okay, the word that you just used, it can be used in different ways, or you can select different words to convey what you mean. Because if you use that specific word, there's a certain lesson that people take away. There's a certain impression that they take away. He's like, I understand what you're saying, but if you use even a slightly different word, people take it differently. And you take it differently. So Robbins himself had said something like, I've been in a position of depression before. It's what really motivated me to get out of my state at the time and being poor and looking for opportunities from there. So now when I'm, everybody still has their days, but now when I'm feeling down or I'm feeling sad or I'm feeling overwhelmed, instead of jumping to the most, I guess, the easiest word that can capture all those emotions, I'm very specific, because if I choose the wrong word, it has a different impact than I would desire on myself as well as other people. So I love that you bring up even just picking the right word for an occasion, a presentation, a letter, whatever it may be, how important that is. But we will get to that. Davina, for you, who are you today? So I read the bio, and where I was going with your rich history is, there's a path of international impact that you're making. So what does that look like in the everyday? I've said in the past to people who have asked, what's your typical week look like? Some people said, I don't have a typical week. But for you, what does your work look like? I know you write, you coach, podcasting, but what is your, I'm going to use the word typical, but if you were to explain a week of your career, of your work, how would you lay it out for somebody?
I am one of those people whose every week is different. Right. So my workday spans from 7 a.m. till 9 p.m. and I take breaks in the middle. Some days I'm serving clients in Europe or the UK or perhaps even Africa, where I try not to start before 7, and I'll have an hour or two with them early. Right. And then I'll go to the gym and take a break and do other things in the middle of the day. And then, if I've got clients here in the US, there might be things scattered during the day. But then sometimes in the evenings, I'm working until 9 at night because some of my clients are in Asia or in Australia. So my day is very scattered, which actually works quite well for me. I don't work solidly from 7 a.m. till 9 p.m. That would be crazy.
I got scared there for a minute. Yeah,
I thought you might. And no, it's not at all that. It's more that it's flexible and it, works in. So that does require me to manage my time and my energy quite well. I've got someone else who manages my diary, for example, because she's much better at managing my boundaries than I am. I want to help people, so I might squeeze things in at my own cost. So, we have some fairly clear guidelines as to how much I do on a day and how much I spread over a week and so on. So it's very eclectic, and I love that. I remember when I started to get into the training work much more, and make it a much bigger part of what I was doing, and this is quite a while ago now. I remember saying to the fellow that I was working with at the time, I said, look, this will see me through the great financial crisis, as we called it. In Australia, I had a big project that came my way, but I can't imagine I'll keep doing it. That's too repetitive, But actually, it's turned out to be quite the opposite. So in between those client sessions and the busy weeks, but then the quieter weeks, I'm thinking harder about how I can help my clients more. How can I show up in a way that means that they deliver, or I deliver for them, more impact in less time? How can I get better and better at helping people communicate with clarity and insight? So it's this wonderful mix of actually doing the work, finding the work, and working out how to help other people better, getting better at my craft.
So then, what does that look like? How did you end up here? What does that path look like from the start of your career? I like to start typically I like to start around high school, into the workforce or into education. What did that path look like to now? If there's something that stands out before then that really set you on this path, a little insider nugget from when you were even younger, whatever that point is to now, what do those highlights and pivot points and learning experiences look like?
Well, I think my journey's been unusual and pretty eclectic. I think I grew up in the country in Australia on a potato farm. And so I was, a country kid. I grew up in the middle of a fairly quiet place. I wouldn't go as far in Australian terms as calling it isolated, but it was, quiet, where it was our family and our neighbors who lived quite a way away. But So we learnt to solve problems. We learnt to be part of something together. We understood what was going on in terms of a business as well as a life on the farm. So it's a very earthy, very grounded sort of, beginning, which I think is a wonderful thing that, increasingly few people have. So I'm very fortunate to have that kind of beginning. And so some things that happened that were pretty pivotal for me in my teenage years were, I used to travel an hour and a half to get to school, for example, an hour and a half to get home, and on the school bus. And when I got home, my mum had 2 extra children, sort of much younger than my other sister and I, so 2 of us and 2 younger ones. So we ended up, my other sister, I'm the oldest, but the next one, with a lot of responsibility for young people quite early on. It was just a lot for our family to have these 2 extra little people come along, and I was the oldest. So I took on responsibility very, very young and made some decisions along with my family that were pretty big for a 16-year-old. I moved out of home at 16 so that I could prioritize my schooling, because it was just very difficult to finish schooling while spending 3 hours a day in transit, and then also doing the kid thing, feeding, bathing the babies, all that sort of thing. So that I think also created quite a streak of independence and resilience in me. So that I think was quite important. And, I moved off to teachers college. I chose teaching because it was something familiar. I had no idea really what a career was all about. I just had no exposure to that. And I knew that I loved young children. And I also knew I didn't want to be on the farm. I wanted to find out what cities were all about. I wanted to see what that was like. And so I went off to college, to a very small city, and, went to teachers college. And, I worked out very quickly that I didn't want to be a teacher, but stuck with it because my father said to me, "You finish what you started."
What was it to you that stood out that made you change your mind when you started it? You can be honest. I
found the curriculum really boring. I realized I needed more intellectual challenge. And I was training to teach, kindergarten children. And I think I felt that as much as I liked my cohort, they just weren't my tribe, right? I just felt really out of place. And, I was majoring in art, which suited me very well. And I remember my art teacher saying to me, "You'll do something, but it's not going to be this, is it?" And so, that also always stuck with me. And thankfully, I have recently actually gone back to art as well. That's always sort of design and so on. It's always been part of what I do. But I've gone back more formally now to the art side. So that piece I've taken away. So I did teach for a short period. And I was very fortunate to be given a job in a different city where I was teaching 4 and 5-year-old boys in a private school. So at that time, it was actually very unusual to get a full-time position out of college. And it was usually people would go as a relief teacher for a period, which I thoroughly recommend, by the way, going straight in a new city as a 20-year-old with 4 and 5-year-old boys who often came from Southern European backgrounds and so had mothers who would sit and wail outside the classroom because they'd let their baby boy go, was really overwhelming.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. And so there were a whole lot of things that just didn't work there. So I finished teaching fairly quickly and jumped into just temping, corporate temping jobs, receptionist, secretary, anything to pay my rent because I didn't want to be on the farm and I decided I needed to do something different.
Anything to stay away from potatoes.
Well, I like potatoes. But I didn't, I got enough of a taste of the city that I didn't want to live on the farm.
Yeah.
But also, I had to pay my rent, right? And so, my parents weren't going to support me. That wasn't the way things were at all. It's like, well, that's your choice. Okay, off you go. Go do your thing, right? And so, and I think too, back in the day when, that was back in the day when you would pay for every minute, if not every second of a phone call. So there wasn't, not only did they not really know how to support me, there wasn't the opportunity. It was too expensive to make those phone calls, right? So it's very much independent problem solving. So I ended up landing in a corporate communication job in a large company at a time when the economy was really wobbly. The economy's played a factor here a few times in my story. But in the early 90s, it was very, very wobbly in Australia. And I just thought, if I get a permanent job, I'm less likely to be turfed out. I better get a permanent job.
Yeah.
So, I took one as a junior in a corporate communications team.
How did you end up in that?
Chance.
Okay.
I was temping in the company as a receptionist, actually in a technology training team. And, they were looking at moving me into training, which was great, but there was no certainty around it because I was a temp. And so when this role came up in the communications area, and it was very junior, but I thought, you know what, it's permanent. I can be confident that at least for a longer period I'll be employed, and I can work out what I want to do then. And it happened that because it was communication, and in my teacher's college training, I had learnt to write from a really beautiful children's author in Australia, I was able to do more than I was hired to do, and I enjoyed it. And my boss, after a year or so, said, I think you should go back to college. I think you should do some more study. So, I don't, to get out of this junior sort of role, I think you need some more, and I think you'd enjoy it. So I did. I said, well, what do you think I should do? He said, well, you seem to like writing, so why don't you look at some of the communication courses? So I ended up studying public relations, and it ended up being a degree in communication management was the technical title of it. So I studied journalistic writing and public relations campaigns and crisis management and legal communication, sort of law and all those sorts of broad things. But in the middle of all of this, I got married to an adventurer and a fellow who wanted to live overseas. And so, I went back to school full time, and we moved to Hong Kong. And I took some freelancing work with me and got a role, but again, wanted something more interesting. And he saw an ad for a job at McKinsey. And initially he saw that and thought, oh, I'd like that. And then he saw what the role was. It was for a communication specialist. And he sort of gave it to me. I remember we were sitting on the couch reading the paper. He said, here, have a look at this. And I had a look at it and said, oh, that's interesting. What's McKinsey? And he explained. And what's management consulting? He explained. I was like, oh, that sounds really interesting. Okay, I'll go for that. And so I applied for the role, and I think the hiring process took about 6 months. And I got the job. I'd not yet finished my degree, so technically speaking, I didn't have a degree at all. I had a diploma in teaching and I had no degree, but they hired me anyway. And that really opened my eyes to what was possible. I grew up thinking anything was possible, but had no idea what that was.
Yeah.
Right?
That's a very good point where people say anything is possible, the world is your oyster, like all these things that you hear and I say it all the time, there's so many things that we hear as kids and they're said over and over. They become cliches because no one really sits down and gives us an example.
Yeah.
No one really sits down and really paints a picture. They just say the cliche or the word and we don't really understand it until we live it, until we get out there and see it. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
What do you attribute, since you didn't have your degree, what do you attribute that to? What do you attribute that they hired you even though you didn't have a degree? What do you think made you stand out?
I'm still not going to ask. I feel so lucky to have got in the door. I think a certain naivete helped me.
Yeah.
Right? Because I might not have been as afraid as I would have been if I had really understood how difficult it can be to be hired in that environment. So I think that naivete helped. I think solving problems from first principles is also something that comes from my background, right? When you're half an hour's car drive at a minimum to anywhere, and you've got a problem to solve, you've got insufficient tools or resources, or if you're cooking ingredients or whatever, but you've got to still cook dinner, or you still got to fix the equipment or whatever it is, you get quite creative. And so I think that helped say, oh, okay, this is a new problem, but how can I, solve this by analogy? What else have I seen that's been like that before? And how can I handle it? So I think my background in that way helped. Naivety and just not really being scared because I had no idea.
That naivety,
helpful.
Yeah, that's funny, yeah,
Because
they're probably just looking at you. They're probably just looking at you like, "Wow, look, like nothing phases her." Mostly because she doesn't know what she's about to get into, but they probably thought it was like a phase of like confidence.
That's think funny. So.
That's great.
And I think too, also not having such a fear of hierarchy. I think some people can be overly deferential to senior people, whereas, I just didn't grow up with that. It's like, oh, you're so-and-so. Great. Nice to meet you. You're a human, right?
Yeah, that's huge.
And I think...
Because it's incredible how much people hold back because they do have that deference. Where they can still show respect. Hey, you're higher up in the hierarchy. You put in your time. You have certain people that make it up there. You have your wisdom. You should be respected, to a certain extent, but that doesn't mean I should silence who I am or what I can bring to the table out of fear or anything like that. So that's a great point.
Yeah. And it's not to say I didn't get nervous when I understood the stakes were high. I did. But I just thought this sounded like a really great opportunity. I had another job, so I wasn't going to be unemployed. I didn't really like my other job much, but I wasn't fearful in any way. It was just, this is interesting. And, I met one of my closest friends in the interview circuit, you're talking 30 years ago. And I remember we met each other and I thought, oh, I'm sunk. They're going to hire her. She's fantastic, And she thought the same thing, but then she corrected herself and said, well, maybe they'll hire too, which is what they did. Oh. And so, you all of these interview opportunities or whatever that you go through, you can come out with something very interesting or useful or expanding. So, I think that was just a really wonderful adventure. And maybe also living in Hong Kong, having, left Australia once before moving to Hong Kong and moving at the suggestion of my, now husband before we were married, because he was like, well, you've never left Australia and I want to live in Hong Kong one day. You want to make sure you like it, and you want to go backpacking and I don't want to do that. So you better go do that now because after I marry you, there'll be none of that,
Yeah.
Right. So 3 months before the wedding, I took off for 6 weeks. My parents were horrified.
Yeah. They were like, our generation never did anything like that. Yeah.
In Australia, I think people traveled more than here, but it was in the early days of this idea that it's almost a rite of passage now for young people to go and travel for a year overseas. Because Australia's so isolated and it's such a small population. Sometimes people will go around Australia or, they'll go away for 3 months or something like that. It's not always a year. But this idea of a gap year after you finish school even or after you finish college and just traveling to explore the world and find yourself and expand and all of that is a big thing. In my day, certainly for where I came from, that wasn't unheard of, but it wasn't common. So I hadn't, at 23 left the country. So I did go backpacking around the UK and I, went from friend to friend or family friend to family friend and then went back via Hong Kong to see if I liked it, and then we got married. So, being a young couple back then in Hong Kong was wonderful. It was before the handover. We were there for the handover back to China. We were there from 96 to 99. And so it was a very, interesting time too. And I'm sure that fed into my sort of perspective in that interview process. It was just a really fun place to be as a young couple at that time.
Yeah, I could see also just that experience you had of 6 weeks of traveling contributing to your confidence in interviewing. Because when you go through schooling or you stay on the farm or you stay in your community and that's all you know, and then you get to for instance, an interview, you've only had one life. You've
Mm,
only
mm.
seen one environment, one landscape. But when you travel like that and it's 6 weeks, and obviously I don't know your itinerary, but I can imagine you went to so many different places. When you can see yourself in those different lenses and what people prioritize and what people appreciate and love and bring out from their culture, I can imagine the girl sitting there in the interview is much different than the girl if she had just stayed on the farm and not left the farm. And,
Oh, yes.
and,
Yes.
it's
Yeah.
crazy that I believe that kind of growth, even in 6 weeks, just from that exposure
Hmm.
is remarkable.
Yeah, it was wonderful. And, I deliberately, I was going on my own. So I made it easy for myself by staying, in the UK where it was English speaking. I just didn't have the confidence
Yeah.
to go beyond that. But I did, I traveled around and did some crazy things and, met all sorts of people. And no, I'd not thought about that as such an influence before, but it was a really memorable time, a really fun time.
Yeah. Yeah. It's incredible that connection wasn't made, but I think I'm just one of those road trip kind of people. So I know that anytime I go somewhere, when I come back, even if it's a day, 2 days, a week, there's something refreshing. You come back to where you are with fresh eyes because you've seen even different weather, different light, different people, different colors, different textures. It's like with anything else, you leave a project and you take a break. When you come back, you're that much better. You're sharper because you've been able to make that comparison. You've been able to distinguish. So I love that for you. That's great.
Yeah, that was really fun and really formative too. Yeah. So, I joined McKinsey in Hong Kong, coming back to your sort of earlier question. And I worked for them for 3 years. And then the financials happened again. The Asian financial crisis happened. And so my husband was being transferred to New York. And
What was
so
he working in,
he
Davina?
was in finance. He was in
Okay.
banking,
Okay.
in finance. And that was one of the reasons that he wanted to move to Hong Kong. There was just so much more opportunity in Hong Kong, and he thought it was such an exciting place that he'd always heard of. So he wanted to go and work in banking, which is why we went there. And so he was being transferred to New York. And so I went with him for a couple of weeks on a trip to see. I'd not been before, and we agreed to move. And then 2 days later, found out we were pregnant with our second child. So that changed things quite a bit for my career. So it took a little while for the visas to come through and all of that sort of thing. And so we moved to New York. I was 6 months pregnant with a 1-year-old and a full-time job offer from McKinsey, which I just couldn't take. Andrew was traveling 5 days a week. And with two little people, I just thought, no, there's just no way I can do that. And also with my earlier experience in, with young children, it wasn't as though, I was happy just to put them in childcare from the beginning and get nannies. And, I've always had some help with the kids, but I didn't want that sort of, they would be in childcare from, 7 a.m. till 9 p.m. type thing.
Yeah.
No, I just couldn't do that. So I took a couple of years out and we bought, renovated and sold a house. I said to Andrew, well, perhaps let's buy a house. That way I can renovate it and I've got a project. I've got something to do, to work towards while I'm at home with the kids. And so we did that. And we bought a house sight unseen just about. And he sent me a fax with 2 houses on it, having been on a tour of New York and seeing a whole lot of houses. Said, which one do you like better? I said, well, that one. So we bought that one. And so we ended up in a neighborhood with 50 children under the age of 10. So he had a very good realtor. It was really a really wonderful time. And then he got transferred again. And
Where was that house? Just out of curiosity.
Was in Westchester, in
Yep.
Larchmont,
Yep.
in Westchester. Yeah, it's a really beautiful town. And we thought, well, we'd be better off being out of the city, in the suburbs, given we had young kids. So, that's all how that came about. But, really lovely, really community oriented, which was good. Now,
so then he got transferred again.
He did, to Tokyo. And so we moved. We had James, our youngest, was 17 months old, and Adam was just under 3. So we moved to Tokyo. And that was really good. It was such a different sort of city. Hong Kong's really bustling, and, people are a bit brash, and, you walk down the street and somebody will just sort of walks through you. They're very in your face and very, here's what I think,
Mm-hmm.
New York's a bit like that too. It's brash and tooting of horns and all this sort of thing. And then you get to Tokyo, where everyone is so polite and so courteous and so, so very different. So it was a very easy move in that regard. There's, so little friction in your day to day. And so we were only there for a short period, though, for reasons which had to do with his company. The head of his division actually died in between him being hired and him starting, and the whole investment bank just exploded. And so we were there for 6 months. But while we were there, at least the boys and I were there for 6 months, I had an opportunity to start working again. So somebody at McKinsey in Hong Kong was looking for a part-time support on a big project. There was a marketing project. So I started working again freelance while I was there. And so during that year where we lived in 4 countries, which was crazy, right? It was insane. And Andrew was gone for so much of it too, right? But I would work in the evenings for a few hours. And so that got me working again, and got me going at McKinsey again. So I worked for them for probably another 12 years, I think, freelance, doing all sorts of things. There was that project for the marketing practice. It was a communication piece. Then there were teams that needed support. There were offices that needed training. We moved back to Australia then after a few years, and so I was training. Pyramid principle is the technique. It's called structured thinking back in Australia, and I was working for Firm Learning out of the US, and not working lots and lots, but there was a little bit sprinkled through the whole time. There might be somebody who was going up for partner, and could I coach them on their communication skills, or, just all sorts of things. And so I did that for quite a while. And then, I decided I wanted to have something that was actually a bit more of a proper job as the kids got older. And so I started working for somebody. I called him up. I said to some friends in the morning, I'm going to go and start looking for work this week. It's time. It's sort of one of these girls having coffee in the morning after they've dropped their children at school. And what are you going to do today? Well, I think maybe it's time to go back to work. I'm going to go and talk to some people. So I made a phone call to somebody that I'd worked with at McKinsey before, who was in a different firm, and he had his own firm. And I rang him and said, "Oh, can I have coffee with you? I'd like to talk to you about, coming back to work." And he goes, "Oh, you want to come back to work?" I said, "Yeah, I'd like to." "Okay. Can you be here in half an hour?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Look, don't put a suit on, but would you do this sort of thing or that sort of thing?" I said, "Yeah, okay, I can do that. So long as there's not too much math. Yeah, okay, fine." He goes, "Okay." So I started working again for him. And that really got me going, back into...
What kind of work was that?
That was actually consulting. And it was coaching business bankers how to bank, which was quite different. But it was just leadership coaching, really.
Okay.
So, I was just filling in for somebody who'd been away, was taking a month off, and a project had been extended. And so could I fill in? And then, it extended again. So I worked with him for a while until the great financial crisis started to hit. And then I rang the second person, that was on my list from back in the day at McKinsey and started coaching lawyers. So, it just different sides of the same sort of work. And, this was a really fun piece of work that really nudged me to do more of the coaching and training, particularly around the structured thinking toolkit. And that was to teach lawyers to get their advice across in 30 seconds.
Davina, just curious jumping in at this point in the story, because you've mentioned obviously different industries that you've worked in. Can you comment on that? The diversity, what communication, not so much what communication looks like. I think we all have an idea of what it might look like. It might look like in finance, in legalese, if you will. But what comments would you make on your experience in those different fields when it comes to communication and coaching somebody in communications? What differences might you have seen?
There are far fewer than you might think, right?
Okay.
So the content is different. The stakeholders are different. The purpose might be different. But ultimately, it's all about clarifying and conveying often complex ideas so that other people can understand them or act on them. And so, the law is perhaps an extreme example of that. And lawyers often have a particular way of communicating in writing, where, and other technical disciplines mirror this, where they write down their problem-solving journey before they get to the answer. Somebody described it to me last week as build, bang. You're building up towards the answer and then bang, here it is. And the problem with that, if you're the audience or you're not an academic reviewing a thesis or something where you really want to understand somebody's problem-solving journey, to analyze that journey, in a business setting, is that actually what you want is the answer and why it's the right thing. And so the core approach around the ideas that you want to convey is the same.
Yeah.
And that's part of the toolkit that comes out of McKinsey, though. That's part of the game, if you like, that makes it possible to swap from, the most extreme sectors, literally in a day. I have had days where maybe I've had 3 coaching sessions and I'm thinking of the day and trying to remember what the different things were, but the difference was just extraordinary in terms of, hierarchy, industry, topic. And it honestly, other than needing a bit of a break in between to sort of let my own energy recover, it's really the same method.
Yeah, I mean, not that they're anything like kids necessarily on the surface, but I've talked about how similar leadership tenets are from pre-K to senior level executives.
Yeah.
That you change the vernacular, the wording, the tone, obviously, like you said, based on the circumstances, but that the lessons are very similar. Obviously, as it applies to communications, know your audience, know who you have to convey these lessons to. But it's incredible how these are all different worlds, from my daughter in preschool to one kid in elementary school, my other kids in middle school. I've worked with senior executives, executive directors. All the lessons are the same. I find myself trying to convey lessons to my kids, and it's the same lesson as what I work through with clients. Obviously, just the wording, the explanation, the tone a little different, but it's incredible how it may be cookie cutter in some sense in a couple areas.
Well, I think cookie cutter, sort of. I think there are some fundamental principles underneath how you convey an idea in a way that it resonates with other people. And, people talk about storytelling and the hero's journey and so on, which is sort of very interesting ideas. And, they're very useful for certain settings where you are taking people on a journey. But there's also a lot of other settings where I play where, it's not for entertainment. You've got a very busy audience. It doesn't matter if they're a client or a partner in a firm or, a chairman of a board or, frankly, the person working for you on your team. It doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. Everybody's busy. Everybody's got a lot to do. Everybody wants to get as much done. In fact, I'd reframe that. Everyone wants to get as much delivered as possible in the time, in the minimum time. And so in that setting, we don't want to take people on this journey very often. I think that storytelling stuff has a place. But for the most part, we want to be able to say, here's my point of view on this that I've really thought about. And here's what needs to come behind that. Now, maybe you're instructing somebody how to do something. Here's how I think you should approach it. And here's the steps to take, right? So you've got a series of very clear steps to take, beginning with that context setting idea at the beginning, and then breaking it down into smaller parts in a way that's really logical. So it becomes a hierarchy. And that core method becomes like that idea is cookie cutter, I suppose, but it's so flexible. That's what I've come to see.
Yeah. I think, when I meant cookie cutter, I didn't mean on the whole, I didn't mean the majority of it. I think it's the only thing that's cookie cutter is that there's nothing that's cookie cutter. It's just this it's just, there's an awareness where I can use the same tools. And one of the major tools, the first tools is, assessment, curiosity, openness to whatever that environment, whatever that profession is. Thank you for that response just on those different areas. So I'd be curious then, from that point where you were taking obviously another financial crisis that you came across, but then what led up to the work that you're doing now, your company, how did the path lead you there?
Yeah. So look, I think it grew fairly organically. And so I was helping lawyers clarify and convey their advice so they could get across in 30 seconds. And that was, a big piece of work for a couple of years that then, dwindled off as we got the guts of the work done. There were about 1,000 lawyers between us. So I was working with my late business partner. So we did that together. And then I guess I had more capacity as I was doing that, reinforcement work, training new employees and so on, rather than going through the bulk of the firm. And so that then led me to think, okay, well, perhaps I can find some other clients on the back of this and start to build out my own sort of practice. And so, Jared, my business partner, was quite busy. Occasionally he would have a lead that was something he didn't want to do or something he couldn't do for whatever reason, and he might pass that to me. Or somebody from my McKinsey days might refer me something. Somebody I'd met might say, how about you come in? And just slowly I started building my own practice. And so that just evolved over time. And, by the time we got to COVID, I had, my kids were in college. So I sort of navigated this. We moved cities again. We moved back to Australia, to Melbourne. And for health reasons, my husband needed a more humid area and my oldest son did too. So we moved to Sydney and I took the business with me, and COVID came. My kids were at college and I'd already started, doing online work. So because of my teaching background, and I've missed a step because of, the legal work, running 300 whole day workshops for lawyers, I felt like a wind-up monkey a little bit, because it was, okay, you teach the stuff, but then you coach the stuff, and that's harder and more interesting. And I wondered if there was a way to flip the classroom so that everybody could learn the basic ideas before I worked with them. So when we came together, I didn't feel like a wind-up monkey.
Yeah.
And
laying that foundation over from the get-go, from the start. And yeah. I mean, it's good for them, but kind of wrote just going through the motions for you. Yeah, I get that.
But I think actually it's good for them too, because what I came to understand, and I was working in an MBA program as well as one of my clients as part of this, and just thinking, well, the way they teach isn't one and done. it really, it's all about, okay, so you learn a bit, you go away and you do some assignments, you come back and you learn some more and you get feedback and you do that. And I was sort of harking back to my teaching days, and we'd started implementing some of this with the lawyers too. But it's like, okay, how can I really optimize the experience for my clients so that they learn more? And I found that by breaking the learning into parts and giving, the rote stuff, the stuff that I would repeat, giving that recorded, meant that people would learn and do. And the outcomes are so much better, right? And so I kept pushing that to see how far I could go with it. And then, around 2017, I started seeing, Zoom and online technologies come into play. We'd had WebEx before, but it was clunky and it wasn't widely used. And I delivered online training at McKinsey for global cohorts, but it wasn't so everywhere. But suddenly Zoom came in and it was everywhere. And it's like, okay, I wonder if I can stop traveling as much and I could do some online cohorts. I wonder if that'd be, I wonder if that'd work. So I started doing that and my clients started to want that because, you think you've got a dispersed team, you have to fly them all in for training. And if this training's broken into pieces, then you've got to fly them all in a few times. Mm-hmm. And that gets quite expensive and time consuming and difficult to schedule and all of that. So it sort of started on this journey of what if we could do a lot more of this online and it would be a win-win for everybody. I wouldn't have to fly so much. They wouldn't have to fly so much. And the learning can be chunked in a way that you might in a more academic sort of setting. And so I started doing that. And of course, COVID hit. And so we were really well set up for that. And that's when my business really took off because people knew that I had these online offerings and they wanted team programs for everybody to give them opportunities to work together and to learn together and to just be with their colleagues in a way that they were doing less during COVID. In Australia in particular, we were locked down for a very long time. So, I started doing, nearly, or at that time, all online work. And that also made it easier then to move here to the US 2.5 years ago because my clients were used to working mainly online with me. So that, smoothed that transition for sure.
Davina, does it make sense from your childhood that this is what you're doing? How do you speak to that?
No, it makes no sense at all.
As I was asking it, I'm like, this is the dumbest question to ask. But
it does in one way, though.
Yeah,
my mum was a teacher.
Yeah, not that exactly. So not that it follows through, not that you knew that's where you were going to end up, but please, continue making that connection between who you were then and who you are now, what comes through.
So my mum was a teacher. In fact, I'm a fourth generation teacher. My mum and her sisters, her mother,
wow.
They're all teachers. And so my great grandparents through her were also. And so I think there's that piece that just, back in the day, I'm thinking my great grandparents' days, it was more a matter of, it was a really esteemed profession and something that if you didn't come from wealth, you could do that was a profession. Mm-hmm. But, in my mother's day, it's something a woman could do. And in mine, it was, a different set of decisions. But it's also, I think, just something that about helping other people. It's a good profession from that point of view. And I really enjoy helping other people. So I think, those two threads come through. But it makes no sense, does it? It really doesn't.
I've gotten to the point where my own career, my own business, who I am today is haphazard, where my parents were blue collar. I was the first to go to college. I had no white collar role models in any of my parents' circles. You know, all they knew were blue collar workers. I was interested in psychology.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted me as far away from blue collar work as possible.
Yeah.
So it was like, okay, business,
Yeah.
right? In my mind,
Yeah.
psychology, okay, psychology and business, okay, market. So it was like always, and now I'm interested in leadership and
Yeah.
organizational behavior and mediation.
Yeah.
So, I mean, those are very interesting stories when somebody kind of pivots in different ways, but then at the end, it just all ties up.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're all still works in progress, but it all ties up
Totally.
beautifully where all their experiences as
Mm-hmm.
they kept pivoting to different things
Mm-hmm.
all applies, all contributes to who they are today. So, yeah, we laugh that it doesn't make sense, but you know, everything up until now for you, for me, has served a major purpose,
Oh, yeah.
has paid a major contribution to who we are
Yes.
here today doing what we're doing. So
Yes.
I love
Yes.
those haphazard kind of winding stories, but somehow you always end up where you're supposed to be.
Yes. And I think just having an openness to look at a situation and think, okay, well, now what? What do I do now? And
Yeah.
and frankly, the stickiness to stick with things when they're really hard to, you know, I make light of moving a lot and so on, and you know, having 2 little babies in a completely new city and so on. But there's a lot in there that is really hard to stick at. You know, the loneliness that comes with all of that. So I think, you know, a certain amount of grit
Yeah.
comes
Well,
from
I mean, that's what I was going to
change.
say because
Yeah.
I've heard so many stories of that, of families moving, and for the most part, things are changing, but for the most part, in the stories that I've heard, it was always the husband getting the job and the mother staying home with the kids, right? That's changing. It's evolving more. But so what do you attribute to, again, those hardships, but working through that? How did you get through those tough times of, little kids? You had mentioned you were taking on work. I could imagine that helps, but how do you speak to the grit of those relentless moves and starting over and you know, getting beyond that kind of loneliness or whatever you may have felt at the beginning, landing in a new city and a new home?
Yeah, it's you know, I grew up in a place that was fairly isolated, so it gave me a certain amount of ability to be on my own and be okay with that. But I think too, what sometimes, frankly, it just gets down to what choice do you have? You know, you are in a city, you don't know anybody, you rely on the kindness of strangers, and there was such kindness too. I remember, you know, and I think too, you know, in the New York example, which, you know, was quite challenging, also wonderful, but quite challenging sometimes. Very early on, they have this thing called the Newcomers Club. One of the things I love about the US is that certainly in the places that I've lived, that people set up these neighborhood or community groups that are so very welcoming. So I heard about this thing called the Newcomers Club, and I obviously knew I needed company. So I met this woman, her name was Mary Elizabeth, and she's this wonderful extroverted lady. And she was a mum. She had a girl who was almost the same age as my older son. And I think people just looked at me as if to say, oh man, you know, here you are with a 1-year-old and you're obviously pregnant with another one, and you just moved to a new country. We're going to take pity on you a little bit. You know, Mary Elizabeth, you know, included me in her baby group, and it was right just before the summer break. So it was perfect timing because there would have been nobody around, I think, for a while. And so just making the most of any opportunity like that and being really disciplined to get out of the house, you know. My boys and I, they used to love going to see the firemen and the fire engine, right? So you put them in the pram and go for a walk and go and see the firemen. It's like, right, what are we doing today? Well, we're going to go and see the firemen because we've got nothing else to do. Or, you know, even just getting out of the house to go to the shops to buy some milk and some other things. Having things to do where you are interacting. I used to joke with at least I can talk to the checkout person, But, and I had carpenters and painters and so on at the house. It was a renovator's delight that we bought. And so that helped enormously. But I think you just got to get out of the house, right?
Yeah.
You've got to put yourself out there. You've got to step up and rebuild. And, certainly leaving teaching was a big moment when I had to just breathe in and start again. There was a lot behind that. So I just think maybe it's a muscle that you build too. And you think, well, it didn't kill me last time, so it won't kill me this time, And, you lean on friends from previous times too. And just, up in the middle of the night feeding a baby and you think, where is it? What time is it elsewhere in the world? Well,
where can I call
somebody
now?
in that time zone. I'm going to give them a call,
Yeah, that makes sense.
I'm sure I drove some of my Australian friends crazy when I was in England because I would ring for a long chat and I'm sure they had plenty of other things they'd rather be doing.
Yeah.
So, you just do whatever you need to do to, and learn that being generous to other people helps you as well. Right? So
of course.
Being proactive, having people over, inviting them in, organizing things, being that person who says, hey, how about a hike at the weekend? How about this? How about that? And I think in recent times, especially, we all went into our bunkers during COVID, people haven't fully come out again. And so giving people the opportunity to come out, they like that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a bit of, something, however you want to describe it, whatever you want to call it, where, we did kind of lose that and certain things didn't come back. We gained certain things, more self-realizations than communal realizations, if you're comparing them relative to each other. But, and this is a good reminder to really be intentional about reaching out and setting something into motion, and not just, letting it roll out on its own, hoping something happens, but instead really stepping up and being the leader in that capacity. Davina, for you, what do you consider your superpower? I've heard so many powers in this time that I've had with you, but what do you consider your superpower?
Well, I think in a work setting, it is helping people work out what their message is really quickly. And, helping people with thousands and thousands of stories, work stories, and helping to cut through, all of the detail to say, is this what you really want to say? Is absolutely it. And I know we'll get to it in a bit more detail, but I think that was part of the realization that led my late business partner and I to write, our first book, which was The So What Strategy. And we were having conversations where we realized that we'd be with clients and helping them work on something. And we would get to a point, maybe 10 minutes after they'd started telling us about the situation, and say, okay, well, I think you could tell this a few different ways. And we'd go to the whiteboard and sketch up a few different ways of telling the story, a few different structures for it. And say, well, you could tell it like this or like that or like that. What do you think? Do any of those resonate? And they would say, oh yeah, that one. That's that one. So not this one for this reason and not that one for that reason, but yeah, let's try that. And so very quickly, he and I realized that there were common patterns in the way people use these techniques that we were trained in that meant that we could help people more. But I think just doing this stuff for so long means that we can pluck out, well, here's what that story might look like. Here's the shape of it.
For you, I've heard many examples of teachers in your family, schooling, training, workshops. But where do you think your aptitude for communication, where do you think that comes from? Nature versus nurture? Where do you trace those origins to, that specialization? That ear for it, that eye for it, that perception for it?
Oh, I've never ever thought about this. I I think it's a combination of nature and nurture. I guess I have some ability to build on. There's training. I learned lots of different methods of communication. Creative writing from the author at Teachers College, and then the journalistic sort of writing at uni, and then the structured thinking. And then I think, though, the honing that came at McKinsey was very, very important, because it taught such incredible discipline and rigor around, how ideas belong together. Do they belong together? And so getting discipline came from that. And, I think there's a saying, maybe it was Picasso, that, you can't make art by breaking the rules until you know what the rules are. Right? You assume that abstract art is just a lump of blobs on a page, but there's, structure behind it. There's color theory. When it works, it's not just accidental. It looks maybe accidental, but it's not. And, understanding the rules and the principles behind that, and just practicing, combined with just a genuine like of people, I think, is perhaps where it's come to, and a curiosity for the craft. Yeah. But that's my first guess at it. I don't know. I've never been asked that question before.
I love hearing that comment, that no one's ever asked you that. I love that. What do you consider great leadership? How do you define leadership? I love especially asking you this question just based on your trek around the world, different cities and different industries and different kind of work. So for you, Davina, what does leadership mean to you, and what does great leadership look like?
I think great leadership is about knowing the right, or being able to work out the right thing to say to people to get the outcome you need, the judgment to know what that is, the ability to deliver it so that it lands with a whole lot of different people who have different drivers. Some people, will take very clear, straight direction. Others will not, right? Will not take an autocratic leader. And so being able to adjust, having that flexibility, but also being able to take the hard decision early. So, knowing what the right thing is, knowing when it's not working and there needs to be some sort of redirection, and dealing with it effectively and early is I think, great leadership. We often leave things go for too long, hoping they'll improve, or, avoid the conversation or what have you. But if you can have that hard conversation with an individual or with a big group, whatever it is, in a way that gets the result you need early, I think that's a form of genius.
Davina, now we can jump to your book, but even before that, I know you have a few other books. You had referenced one just a couple of minutes ago, but why don't we go through, if you could, the previous two books, I believe. If you could tell me where you were in your career when those books came to be, and how they came to be. That'd be great. And just an overview of what you chose to cover in those books.
Yeah. And I mentioned earlier that Jared and I had realized we had this common set of ways of telling stories. And so we call those patterns. And so we decided to codify those for a few reasons. And so we wrote this one, the So What strategy. For those who are watching video can see, I'm just holding it up. And so that was the first one. And we wanted a book that described the structured thinking principles in a way that wasn't so academic, was still rigorous, that used the principles to tell the story, but focused on, well, how do you use structured thinking in a business setting, not a consulting setting, to tell the most common types of stories? So it's deliberately short, okay? And it has pictures, it has frameworks and diagrams and so on in it. So we wanted something that was easy, that we could use with our clients, and it turns out other people like it too. So that was the first book, and that was very, very useful. Now, over time, I found in my work with my clients that it was great. And I wanted to do something for leaders who were implementing this on their teams. And I found that when I was working with more senior leaders, which just happens as you get older and your client base matures in their career, working with more senior people, I think, that there were, in that early book, we talked about 7 stories. And I think there were always a few more, but there were some that really mattered. And I found that for more complex stories, one, maybe 2 of the 7 that we had weren't described in a way that was flexible enough to accommodate the complexity that we needed. So I set down on a path. I thought, right, I'm going to write a leader's guide. First of all, my thinking was how to implement the So What strategy. So What strategy for leaders was what I was thinking. And I was doing it on my own. Jared wasn't interested in writing another book, so that was okay. And so that's where Elevate came from. And so that's the leader's guide. As I was doing that, what I realized was that those other stories mattered a lot in that context of, senior leaders and boards. And so what do? I can't rewrite the original book because it's, shared intellectual property. So I wrote another one, which is the companion for this. So my initial plan was the So What strategy for leaders, but I ended up writing a set, one for the leader and one for the team, to help them implement this way of working that comes from working together to craft senior communications. So, for example, what tends to happen, this is what I was noticing with my clients, was, the leader would say, hey, can you write an update for the board on your project? Sure. Okay. Or can you tell the board about this issue? Can you update them on this issue? And the brief would be pretty scant, right? And so then the individual, or perhaps a couple of people, would go away and they'd think for a long time about, well, why'd they ask for that? What do we really need? Like, where's this request coming from? What do we really need to write here? And what the natural impulse in not being able to get the answer to those questions is to just include everything on the topic into the document and to deliver back, something complete to the leader that is a PowerPoint presentation or a Word document that includes everything on this topic of this project or this issue or whatever it is. And so what happens then? The leader opens it up and says, okay, they've put a lot of effort into this. They've delivered it to me on time or early. That's great. But they're stuck because they're back to back with meetings. And what do? They think, okay, I'll get to that when I get a break. And they don't, right? They just don't. So then it gets urgent and you have at 9:00 at night after the kids have gone to bed, or maybe over the weekend, Sunday night, they open up their laptop and think, gosh, that's got to be delivered this week. I better get into it. And so they have a look at it and they realize that it's got the kitchen sink in it. And the only way they can actually get to the heart of what is actually trying to be said is to rework it, because they need to go through the thinking process themselves to work out what actually needs to be in the presentation or in the document. So in effect, because they've given a scant brief and the team hasn't known what to do, they've tried to do their best. The team has delegated up to their boss, right? And their boss ends up doing the team's job for them. And some leaders would say, and I would talk to some clients who would say, I take home 400 to 600 pages every weekend, right? In highly regulated sort of environments where there's a lot of reporting, right? And so I'm taking this home every weekend, but I get paid a lot. That's just my job, right? And I started thinking, is it really your job? Is that it's suboptimal? Who wants to spend their nights, their weekends, or early mornings, if they're an early bird, redoing what they want their team to do for them? Nobody wants that. And it means that the team isn't being developed on the job too, because they give this thing, they see no point in crafting something that really hits the nail on the head, because every time they send it up, it gets redone anyway.
Yeah.
Right? So you end up in this self-perpetuating cycle. And so how do we get out of that? And so the work that I was doing with clients was getting them out of that mess, setting the leaders up to lead, setting the teams up to deliver what was really needed in that moment. And so I wanted to codify it. And so I started out codifying it for myself. And then, like I mentioned, started thinking, okay, the leader's book, the leader's guide, that's what I need as a leave behind for my clients. But also in doing that, I thought, well, if I'm going to go to that effort, I may as well write it as a book. And then, there might be other people out there who find it useful as well. But I did find that I needed, the companion in crafting this, in setting the leaders up to know what the stories were. They had to have a basic foundation on how to tell the stories, how to use the patterns, how to structure their thinking, and of course, how to brief, how to review quickly. When working with the lawyers, one of the things we found was that, we're teaching them a structured way to write their advice that gets the main idea out there quickly and backs it up. Because of the structure of our programs, we had to be able to give feedback on legal advice within seconds, right? And you can actually do that if you're sticking to the structure. And so, teaching leaders how to do that so that they can open up something, review it super fast, and give feedback is also really important. That's also a bit of a superpower. So, I codified some of these things in this book and then wrote this one as a companion, as a complete companion to it, so that the leader sets the team up. I've got a framework for the leaders, which I call RISE. So, they ready the team, they iterate on the messaging, they settle the document, and they embed the learning. So they rise, they elevate, they rise together. And so that's part of the goal, to help leaders set their teams up so that they can deliver communication that doesn't need major rework. Okay, so the idea is that they brief well, they map the messaging on a single page, which is then easy to review, and you get that really collaborative way of talking through the messaging rather than, track changes and red pen and critique or, which is just feels critical, and, it's nobody likes doing it or receiving it. Much better to be able to say, okay, we're in the mix of things. Let's work out what the messaging is. Here's my first go at it. Do it live together because we've got a framework so we can do it quickly. Or, if it needs to be, asynchronous, then that's fine too. Then, of course, the team needs to know what they're doing within that. And so I've got a framework that sort of matches up with the RISE framework for the team members too, so they know what their role is at each point in that journey.
Davina, so how do you go about, because I imagine this isn't so much or only solely building off a foundation, but I imagine there's some aspect, I may be wrong, some aspect of reprogramming, relearning,
absolutely,
breaking down bad habits. So
yes.
How do you incorporate that piece? Or in general, the general question is, what's the journey you lead the reader on? How do you structure the book, I guess, in such a way, and it may incorporate that reprogramming, but how did you structure Elevate to get to that point where you kind of retraining in some way, somebody's ears, somebody's eyes, somebody's perception, the way they take things in, the way they show things? How did you structure it in such a way to lead them where you wanted them to be led?
No, that's a perfect question. And what I did was I used the technique that I teach, this structured thinking technique, to lay the book out. So I forced myself, and I use that word advisedly because it becomes a bit of that, where you say, okay, well, here's how you structure a message. Okay, fine. And here's how you use patterns. Fine. But then what does somebody need in order to engage in that? Why would they do it? Well, what does the what's the, like you say, what's the journey that they've got to go on to actually change? And so I've laid the book out in 3 parts. And the first one, it's all action oriented. So number 1 is lay strong foundations, which is all about understanding the problem that you've got. And, if you're a leader, I described earlier, what tends to happen, which is quite a common challenge, where the leaders are reworking. And so the leader buys the book. Okay, let me remind you, or maybe flesh out for you, the things that are going on in your day-to-day that you might think are normal, but don't have to be. And let me measure that. Let's quantify that. Let's give some case studies and help you really relate your circumstance to this and get you to see the prize that's out there that you didn't know was out there. So let's help you see that so that you can actually see that it's possible and really want it. So that's the beginning. And then, it's within the foundations, it's that piece, but then also how to, well, what does the high level answer look like? Do I really want this? Can I do that? So the first section's all about, do I really want this? Why should I do this? Yeah. And so once over that piece, hopefully people have bought into the idea that, okay, all right, I want to do this. So how do I do it? And so in the next section is, okay, how do I lift out of the detail? How do I, go through that RISE framework? So the RISE framework drives that next section. How do I get the team ready so they know what's needed, so that they know what outcome we need, what messaging we need? How do I iterate? How do I teach them to iterate around this one pager? So I have to know how the one pager works, so they do too. So how do we do that? How do I settle a document quickly? How do I review quickly? What am I looking for? How do I score it? I've got a framework that I call SCORE for, reviewing communication. And then, how do I bake that into the way we're working? So what does it look like once we get this thing happening? And then you get to a stage you say, okay, all right, now I get it. Now I see what we need to do. I know what I wanted and I see what we've got to do. But how do I get the team to do it becomes the natural next question. So the next section is all about elevating the team and getting their buy-in and setting them up. And I give them some techniques that they can use if they want to teach them themselves through practical coaching, on-the-job coaching. And of course, I would encourage them to get my online course called Engage or the book Engage for their team, as a support. But if they want to go it alone and teach it themselves, they've got the basics in the book, Elevate, as well. So first, section 1, help them really feel the problem and feel the solution and get excited about it. Section 2, how to actually do it. And then section 3, how to get your team to do it.
Davina, I'm always curious of the authors that I have on here, how they evolved as these books were published. Obviously, this is your field, your specialty. You've been doing it for so long. You've accumulated all this knowledge and wisdom in this field that you've shared with your clients, that you're coaching and working with. But for you, did anything change in you as through the process of putting this book together and the way that you see things, maybe in the way things were playing out in the world that kind of impacted the way that you see or learn from what you're sharing? What evolved in you, not so much from the technical side of writing a book and how tedious that could be, but what evolved in you in the process of getting this book out there?
Well, I think it's ironic that you're saying evolved because I've just put out the revised edition and the revised edition of the other one is there. I think in writing a book, you come to learn your own strengths and weaknesses more. In using this technique to get, the application of any idea is where a lot of the magic is. To understand, to get it, to know it is one thing, but to really be using it and pushing against the constraints of it helps you grow. So I think I'm a much better writer now as a result of doing it because I've pushed myself to try and articulate things that I knew but didn't quite have words for. So I think I'm clearer now in the value that I can bring, or that this approach brings. I think, I rewrote them both to incorporate my new learnings and the failings or weaknesses that I saw in my early versions, to try and leave something behind that is as good as I could possibly do. So, I'm in my late 50s now. So you think, okay, well, maybe I'll work for another decade or so, maybe longer than that. My dad's 91, so maybe my health will keep up. Maybe I keep going
So
for a
those
long
potatoes,
time, right?
the
Those
potatoes are the magic.
And frankly, I think all the manual work that came in the early days for him too.
Yeah.
Right? He's very, very strong. But, I think what has changed in me, I'm much more pragmatic. Writing a book is a huge endeavor that is not economic, right? In the direct sense. It's very useful for me in my consulting work, and I would absolutely do it again, but it's not an economic endeavor. So I think I've become accepting that sometimes there are things that you just feel like you want to do for yourself, which is why I did the revised editions at least. So, this career thing is partly for us and partly, for our clients, this consulting game.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know what else has changed or grown for me in the process of writing and then rewriting these books. I'm glad I've done it. I'm really glad I've done it. It feels like an achievement. Yeah.
Any other books in your future? Any other areas you want to touch upon aside from revisions to these? Is there any other kind of unique direction you'd want to go in at all?
Hopefully no more revisions to those. I think the revised ones, the Elevate one is out now, and Engage will be out in the next few days. Any more books? I'm working on something. I've got two things. I'm working on, I've got a group of people that love to nerd out on this stuff, and they're past clients, right? Who just love getting together, and we get together once a month, and it's been going on for a number of years now. And we just enjoy each other's company. And as an independent consultant, it's really nice to have companions on the journey. I used to have a team of about 10 of us, my late business partner, and we built a team of trainers. And so, that was great. But for various reasons, that all slipped away. And now it's just me. So, having this group of people who are really motivated, sometimes more motivated than I am, frankly, to nerd out on the different aspects of communication. They came to me a while ago and said, how about we do something on figurative language, on analogies and similes and metaphors and that kind of language. And they were a little frustrated that the storytelling movement gets such emotional traction. And they say, well, you only use that in, a small number of places. And people come at that as though being logical and structured is wrong somehow. And what if we came at it the other way and said, you've got to structure your story, but you can layer into it these other kinds of using of language, to bring things to life with imagery and so on. And so we've been playing with that. And I don't know if there's a book in that. I don't know about that. But there's certainly some tools in that. Yeah. Which is very useful. And we're coming toward the end of that piece now. I say, well, maybe we are. I don't know. We just take our time, right? We just meander through it with the idea of it just being enjoyable to have the conversation and think about things we wouldn't otherwise think about. So that might emerge into something. I don't know what, but something. And then after we do that, there's an itch I want to scratch around an acronym which is used in McKinsey problem solving, and it's MICE, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. So it's one of the tests that you have for a story or a problem if you're mapping it, where you say, are there any gaps or overlaps in my thinking? And it's a very powerful tool. And at a basic level, it's really simple. It's like, are there any gaps? Are there any overlaps? You have a look at it. Yeah, sure. But actually using that deeply is hard. It's really hard, right? No gaps is not so hard. But so let me reframe that. No overlaps is not so hard. But no gaps is actually really hard. Because how do you know you're talking about the right thing? How do you know you've got the right boundary around the ideas you're conveying? And how can you use this as a tool to work out what's missing from your story so that your leader doesn't find them for you? You know, is there a simple checklist we can build? And I mean, you would know, this sort of a simple checklist has got heaps underneath it, which is why it works, why it's robust, why it actually is useful. So doing a bit more work under that would be interesting. And I think this little group of people are very up for that discussion. So we might play with that. We've done some work on this particular thing already, but then we deviated. And we do that. We just go where the wind takes us a bit because that's part of the fun of it. Right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
It's nice to not have a purpose, right?
Yeah.
To have a purpose but not have a purpose at the same time is really,
yes.
And in that work, you don't have that.
It's interesting how when I started my career, like you get so defined. This is what I want. This is what it looks like. This is what I will be happy and fulfilled by. And now it's still the same, but it's like a very broad general direction. And there's multiple pieces that kind of contribute sensations and feelings and satisfaction. So it's not so targeted. Again, purpose, but not having a purpose. As long as you're heading in that general direction, you can call it a North Star, whatever you want to call it. But I completely get that. Yeah. Just did a podcast with a friend of mine where we're covering The Alchemist. And in short, it's kind of like a fable, a story with an endpoint, what the character wants. And we talk about treasure and what we want in our lives. And it just all plays out like, whereas as long as you're heading in that direction and taking advantage of what you come across in the everyday, how you interact with people, your successes, your pitfalls, whatever it is, it's just so much in the everyday of life. If you take note of it, that for me is fulfilling, as opposed to just having that, this is what it has to be, this concrete, whatever it may be. Sometimes, brainstorming with somebody for a couple hours on a topic is just as satisfying as your idea of what a final goal should have been. So I'm with you, Davia.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what is like the one takeaway that you hear, or what's the most common response you've gotten from leaders, maybe a certain part of the book or a certain part of a training or workshop? What's the one kind of aha moment that you've heard the most from your audience, from those you work with? Is there something that stands out where they're like, oh, they're all kind of saying or seeing the same thing?
Absolutely. And it's pretty stark, actually, what it's so consistent. And that is, we just need to think so much more about what we need to say before we jump in and prepare our communication. I think there's a secondary one, but that is the primary one where people just say, oh, we just got to spend the time thinking up front, and we're just not doing that. We're so busy, and we're so busy on executing that we don't realize that a lot of that busy is actually unhelpful. It's not productive because you're spinning your wheels editing. Whereas if we'd thought more up front, we could save ourselves a lot of time later and actually make the PowerPointing or the writing more pleasurable. People talk about writing to think, but actually if you think before you write, you end up in a much better place. So, that is the number one. The other one is that if you have a framework that gets your messaging on a page, the collaboration is much better. And it's actually really valuable to have a couple of people in a session, half an hour, to say, okay, what is the messaging for this? And they would never think of doing that before, right? So that's also, something that I think my clients do more after they work with me, and it's more pleasurable than that critical, tic-tacking around a draft with track changes and so on.
As someone who works in communication, telling of stories is a big part of it. Collection of thoughts, right? Analysis, assessment. So as somebody who's using communication and utilizing it so much and providing it and sharing it with so many people, do you journal yourself? I'm just curious how somebody who is in the communication field in so many different practices in so many different ways, what your own kind of process is for clarifying your own messaging to yourself.
So when I'm needing to prepare a communication for somebody else, well, I try and just use what I've learned and what I'm teaching, honestly, and be very conscious of the outcome I need before I start. And I think the trap for me is that the teaching can be, to use your term, a bit cookie cutter, in the sense that you have things that work with people, right? Presentations that work in certain settings. So when a setting changes or a set of requirements change, I have to go back to the beginning and quite deliberately think, okay, well, what's different here? Why do I need to do this differently? What is it they're really looking for? So that I can then be very specific in what I'm delivering. And, I did something yesterday where I was having a workshop just for half an hour on how to write better updates. And it's like, okay, what do I really need to do here that gets me to think back from first principles? Right? And then, of course, it's always the tests. Have I structured it well? Does it meet the basic tests of structure, which is such a tool for helping see when ideas are disconnected, whether they're not, sitting next to each other really nicely, or they're not in the right place in the hierarchy, or they just don't belong. So,
but even for you, Davina, aside from how you may prepare communications to work with somebody, business work aside, your own personal
other communications,
your
like
own
personal communication.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a lifelong journey too, isn't it? And look, I'm a big fan of frameworks. So when I find a good new one, I learn it and then, start to apply it. And one that I've come across recently is Enneagrams. And I'm finding that very, very helpful. I've learned work styles before. I've learned Myers-Briggs before. I've learned, other sorts of personality frameworks. But learning this one, I'm finding fabulous because I think it's quite practical. And, in a conversation, thinking, well, what is the right way to, or not necessarily the right way, but the most helpful way to tackle an issue or an objection or a concern, or, thinking, how do I tailor my conversation, my approach with other people according to not just what feels instinctively right. I tend to go with instinct quite a lot. But, okay, how can I fine-tune that instinct to be a little bit smarter about, okay, I can see there's conflict here, there's tension, there's a bit of a flinch. Okay, what led to that? How do I handle that? How can we make that useful, rather than, that's, reacting.
In the
fine-tuning that ability to respond,
Yeah. In the end, do you get to your weird question I don't think I've ever asked? In the end, because you're so good at helping people and brainstorming communication, and obviously you've spoken to how you may do it yourself in your personal life, we're instinctual, emotional animals. Sometimes it feels good just to get it out.
Oh, doesn't it?
Where we don't have, you know what I mean? Where we don't have to overcraft it, refine it, and this and that.
Yeah.
So how do you make sure to get everything that you want out, even though, yes, you try to refine it so it lands with the other person? Does that make sense, that question?
It does, although I'm just thinking, for me, it helps to put something in a context, what
Yeah, of course.
context. So what context would you be thinking of?
I don't know. Honestly, the first one that comes up is an argument with somebody.
Oh, goodness.
You know what I mean? Where you have the emotion of something, and yes, you have the emotional intelligence where you kind of slow things down, stay up here, your upper, cortex and whatnot, and you're like, okay, I got to say it this way so it lands properly. So I just see you do so much preparation with your client. So much of your work is preparation to get to the logical.
Right. Yeah.
So it's like, when do you get to get your emotion out if everything is kind of.
Yeah. And so you're thinking there in conflict too. I absolutely do, and can be far too emotional. I think my learning about myself is that if I'm in conflict, right, and I have to slow down and really stay calm, or it's crazy, right?
Yeah.
So I know, if my husband and I have conflict, I remember we've had these discussions a long time ago where we would be like, about something, and I would be calm, like just not engaging in it because I was so mad, right? So I become very controlled when I'm really mad. It like focuses me.
Yeah.
Right? And he thought that meant I didn't care at all. It's like, actually, it's because I care such a lot that I become like that. So for me, emotion comes out in different places. And it tends to be, I'll hold on to it for too long.
So to that end,
I have pajama weekends, John.
So that may be part of it.
Just hit it. I've been trying so hard for so long. There's nothing left in the
exactly.
tank,
So I was just curious, as somebody whose specialty in work has been so carefully crafting the way we put certain things that it melds into your life. You're like, okay, from my training, I know personally I have to kind of do. It's like, when do you let to?
Yeah.
And that's what you just said. Sometimes I just have my pajama weekend.
I have not pajama
I guess
days.
the question is
pajama weekends. It's like, okay, I've got to clear the decks because, humans don't want to be with me right now. I know that.
Yeah. But, so I guess I was curious because everything else is so structured and communication is our everyday. And your commitment to communication is so strong. I can see it kind of infusing your personal life. I was curious what your self-care might be.
Oh, absolutely. And
Okay.
I think too, one of my latest things, I mentioned that I studied art as my major, and, being a mom and moving a lot and working and all of that, I could have baked it back into my life. I should have. It would have been much more nourishing for me if I had done. And I've had seasons where I've painted or I've
comes and goes
or whatever. But now I'm being much more disciplined about it. And so literally I've got a 6.5 foot standing desk here, right? And so on the right-hand side of it is my easel, because I don't have at the moment a spot for an easel. So spending time doing things like what I'm showing you here on the screen right now and having it really close by and, just doing that sort of stuff and getting lost in it is, for me,
I think that's
great therapy, and I just, it gives me such pleasure. It's a weird thing because, like, how many pictures can you draw or have in your house? Not that many, really. You've only got that many walls. So what do you do with it all? You've got to have, if you're going to keep doing it, it's got to be, a use for it. So anyway, that's part of the adventure of that. And I've got friends that I do, we have an art teacher, coach, trainer, guide that we work with. And the friendship that comes with that is really beautiful too.
Perfect.
One of my best friends from Hong Kong lives here in Seattle too.
Oh, perfect.
And I was talking to her before Christmas and said that I was planning to go back and do these art classes. And she sort of was, curious about them. And I told her what I was doing. And she said, oh, my husband and my son gave me this watercolor paint by numbers thing. for Christmas, and I love it. And like, she's a tax lawyer, right? So she's not, wouldn't call herself, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn, naturally creative. But she's like, oh, I'm just loving it. I'd love to do more of that. Would you mind if I came to the class with you? So I'd love it. I'd love that. And she's really getting into it and discovering a part of herself she didn't know about. And we made another friend as part of our classes together. So now the three of us, the art musketeers. So having things like that in your life, in
Absolutely.
sport and exercise and things to do with your friends that you like to do, of course, is all part of the life journey. It doesn't all have to be structured and so on. But, the art is the latest thing. It's really beautiful.
The latest thing, exactly. Davina, one more question before starting to wrap up. Obviously, we're here talking about your book, your books, right? What book has inspired you or moved you the most, impacted you the most in your life, your leadership, your work, something that just hit, that was profound for you? What left an indelible mark? What book?
I'll go with a recent one, and that was, it's called, well, let me think. Do I want to go with that one? Maybe I won't. Let's just jump in. It's called Making Time for Strategy. And it's by someone that I know called Richard Metcalf. And it just demonstrated to me how going up a level isn't necessarily about doing more. It's about doing different things. And so that little gem has been really wonderful because, it's the heart of prioritizing, isn't it? Right? And I've often thought, I'd love to do all these other things and I'd love to do more. I'd love to be, marketing my online courses more or doing more things. But it's like, no, actually, to get the outcome, it's not about doing more. It's about doing it differently. Which was quite comforting, actually, because it can be a bit overwhelming to think, okay, I've got to do more.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And that kind of plays into that book that I mentioned before, The Alchemist, where it's kind of like one of the quotes from one of the characters had something to do with dreams. This entire book is about chasing your dreams, your personal legend, getting to that thing that is yours. And it works along those lines in terms of one of the characters says something to the effect of even just having the dream is worth it. Because I think it was a character, Muslim. He always wanted to go to Mecca, but he never got there, but he was fine with it. And I think somebody referencing his story said something to that effect where even just having the dream, something that you think you're working towards, the work is worth it. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Now, Davina, in wrapping up, what are you up to these days? Is there anything else that I might have or should have asked? Anything you want to share? Anything you're up to? Anything at all? Please, the floor is yours.
Wow. Well, I think I've shared most of the things I'm up to. I've put out the revised editions of the books and, I've got my online courses, which are becoming a new focus for me. Learning, of course, to work with AI in communication is, of course, a focus at the moment. But from a professional standpoint, I think we've covered the gamut pretty well, adjusting to life in the United States and loving it. That's a big part of what's going on now too.
Incredible. And again, Davina's shared her book, Elevate: How to Lift the Quality of Thinking in Your Team's Board Papers Without Rewriting Them Yourself. She also shared her other books. I'll incorporate and include all those books, all her links in the show notes when I publish this. Davina, thank you so much for being here, for sharing this, for letting me keep you here for this long, just to kind of learn about you, your books, and everything that you've done. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, John. It's been a really wonderful conversation. I'm glad we got to have it.
Absolutely. And if there's anything I might have missed, please let me know. So much to cover, so little time. Anything you're curious about, just let me know and I'll reach out to Davina and see what kind of insights, guidance, wisdom, any of it I can get back. In the meantime, thank you for watching, listening, and subscribing, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.